In 1666, a single spark in a London bakery unleashed one of history's most destructive infernos. The Great Fire of London didn't just burn buildings, it reshaped an entire city. Here's how it all began. London in 1666 was a very different place from the city we know today. It was a bustling, crowded city filled with narrow, winding streets. The houses were mostly made of wood and plaster, and they were built very close together. Sometimes the upper floors of the houses would jut out over the street, almost touching the houses on the other side. This made the streets below dark and cramped. This was a city that had grown organically over centuries without much planning. It was a tinderbox, a disaster just waiting for a single spark to set it all alight. And on a quiet night in September, that is exactly what happened. The story of the Great Fire of London begins in a very ordinary place. It started in a small bakery on Pudding Lane, a narrow little street not far from London Bridge. The baker's name was Thomas Farriner. He was a baker to the king, so he was quite well known. On the night of Saturday, 1st September, he went to bed believing that the fire in his oven was safely out. But it seems a few embers were still glowing deep inside. In the early hours of Sunday, 2nd September, those embers sparked a small fire. It was a tiny beginning for what would become a massive catastrophe. At first the fire was small. It likely smoldered for a while before catching on to some nearby firewood. The Farriner family was asleep upstairs and was woken by the thick smoke filling their small house. They were trapped. The stairs were already on fire, so they could not go down. Their only way out was to climb through an upstairs window and crawl across the rooftops to the safety of their neighbor's house. A maid, however, was too frightened to make the dangerous crossing. Tragically, she became the fire's first victim, a sad beginning to a week of terror and destruction. From that one small bakery, the fire began its relentless march. The flames found plenty to eat. The bakery was full of flammable materials like flour and wood. Outside, the strong east wind began to fan the flames, pushing them onwards. The fire leapt from the bakery to the hay and straw stored in the yard of the Star Inn next door. From there, it was only a matter of time before it spread to the neighbouring wooden houses. The people of London were about to wake up to a nightmare, a fire that would change their city and their lives forever. The fire spread with terrifying speed. You have to imagine the scene. The buildings in 17th century London were perfect fuel for a fire. They were made of dry timber, covered in a sticky, flammable substance called pitch. The long, hot, dry summer had made everything even drier. When the sparks from Pudding Lane landed on these buildings, they caught fire almost instantly. The strong wind acted like a giant bellows, pushing the fire from one rooftop to the next. It created a firestorm, a massive wall of flames that moved faster than a person could run. Stopping the fire was an almost impossible task. The firefighting methods of the time were very basic. There was no fire brigade like we have today. People relied on simple leather buckets filled with water from the River Thames. They would form long lines or bucket chains to pass the water from the river to the fire, but this was like trying to stop a flood with a teacup. The fire was too big and too hot. The heat was so intense that it evaporated the water before it even reached the flames. The firefighters couldn't get close enough to make any real difference. The Lord Mayor of London, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, was woken up to be told about the fire. At first, he was not very worried. He famously said, "Pish! A woman might piss it out." He went back to bed thinking it was just a small fire that would soon be put out. This was a terrible mistake. By the time he realized how serious the situation was, it was too late. The delay meant the fire had grown much, much larger. His indecision and failure to act quickly allowed the small bakery fire to grow into an uncontrollable monster that was now devouring whole streets. The main strategy for stopping a large fire in those days was to create a fire break. This meant pulling down houses in the fire's path to create a gap that the flames could not cross. But this was a slow and difficult process. They used long poles with hooks on the end to pull down the timbers. The Lord Mayor was hesitant to order the destruction of people's homes. He was worried about who would pay for them. This hesitation cost the city dearly. By the time the order was finally given, the fire was already too powerful and was simply leaping across the gaps they made. As the fire raged, London descended into chaos. The streets, which were already narrow, became completely blocked with people and their belongings. Everyone was trying to escape the flames. People grabbed whatever they could carry. They loaded carts with their most precious possessions, furniture, bedding, clothes, and anything they thought they could save. This created terrible traffic jams. The narrow lanes were clogged with carts, animals, and panicking crowds, making it almost impossible for anyone to move. The air was thick with black smoke, making it hard to see and breathe. The River Thames became the main escape route. It was a scene of absolute pandemonium. The water was covered with boats and barges of all sizes. People were desperate to get their families and their goods away from the burning city. They loaded their things onto any vessel they could find, paying huge sums of money to the boat owners. The river was the safest place to be, looking back at the terrifying wall of fire that was consuming their homes. From the water they could only watch in horror as street after street and church after church disappeared into the flames. During this time, life was a struggle for survival. There was no food or water. The fire had destroyed the water pipes and the markets. People who had escaped the fire now faced a new problem: starvation. They camped in the open fields outside the city walls in places like Moorfields and Finsbury Hill. They had lost their homes, their jobs, and all their possessions. They were refugees in their own country with no idea what the future held. The King, Charles II, and his brother, the Duke of York, set up command posts and ordered that bread be brought in from the surrounding villages to feed the hungry crowds. Amidst the chaos, some people tried to protect their most valuable items in a very unusual way. Samuel Pepys, a famous diarist who wrote about the fire, was worried about his wine and his special Parmesan cheese. He decided that the safest place for them was underground, so he dug a pit in his garden and buried them. This might seem strange to us, but it shows the desperation people felt. They were trying to save any little piece of their former lives. For Pepys, saving his cheese and wine was a small act of hope in a city that was being completely destroyed. After 4 long days, the fire finally began to die down. On Wednesday, 5th September, the strong easterly wind that had fanned the flames finally dropped. This gave the firefighters a chance to get the blaze under control. They also started to use gunpowder to blow up entire rows of houses, creating much bigger firebreaks that the fire could not cross. This was a drastic and destructive measure, but it worked. By Thursday, the Great Fire of London was finally over. But the city that remained was just a smoking, blackened ruin. The scale of the destruction was almost unbelievable. The damage was immense. The fire had destroyed a huge part of the city. More than 13,200 houses were gone. 87 parish churches had been burned to the ground. The magnificent St. Paul's Cathedral, one of the glories of medieval London, was a complete ruin. Its huge lead roof had melted and flowed down the streets like a river of metal. Amazingly, the official death toll was very low, with only a handful of deaths recorded. However, many historians now believe that more people died, but their bodies were simply burned to ash in the intense heat, leaving no trace. In the aftermath of the fire, London had to be rebuilt. This was a massive opportunity to create a new, better and safer city. King Charles II wanted to build a modern city with wide, straight streets inspired by Paris. Architects like Sir Christopher Wren presented grand plans for a new London. However, rebuilding the city exactly as it was before was quicker and easier. People owned their plots of land, and redrawing all the property lines would have been too complicated. So while the streets largely followed the old medieval pattern, the buildings themselves were very different. The most important lesson learned from the fire was the need for better building materials. A new law was passed, the Rebuilding of London Act of 1667. It stated that all new houses had to be built from brick or stone, not wood. The streets were made wider and new sewers were installed. Sir Christopher Wren was put in charge of rebuilding the city's churches, and he designed 51 beautiful new ones, including his masterpiece, the new St. Paul's Cathedral. The Great Fire was a terrible disaster, but from its ashes, a stronger, safer and more beautiful London began to rise.